There are two ways of looking at the question, is the UK whiter than white when it comes to race relations? Is it blame-free, or does it actually treat unfairly those from minority and ethnic backgrounds? And that is a question we will try to answer as we examine a report that controversially claims there is no sign of institutional racism in the country. This is Roundtable. Hello and welcome from me, David Foster. So does the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities normalise white supremacy, as has been said, or is the UK actually ahead of other societies in at least examining the issue? The report commissioned by the UK government concluded that there was no institutional racism in the United Kingdom. It went on to praise Britain for being what it called a model for other white majority countries for its success in tackling race-based disparities. Boris Johnson's government established the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities in June of 2020 after the death of George Floyd in the United States and worldwide Black Lives Matter protests. But there have been calls for ministers to withdraw the report in a letter signed by more than 20,000 people, including the actor Riz Ahmed and groups such as the Runnymede Trust, Liberty and Black Lives Matter UK. 20 or more of the bodies and individuals cited in the review distanced themselves from the findings, saying the government either ignored their testimonies or misappropriated their research. Many critics say the report is wrong to overlook institutional racism, when people from black and ethnic minority groups have died disproportionately through the COVID-19 pandemic. So where does it all leave the fight for racial equality and social justice in the United Kingdom? I'm delighted to be able to say that we have three guests returning to Roundtable. First of all, we say hello to, in London, Lee Jasper, who was Senior Policy Advisor to the former London Mayor Ken Livingstone. We move to Wolverhampton, where we can see social commentator and historian Patrick Vernon, and in London, Aaron L.A. Zacharias, trainee solicitor who studied issues of race and class and who grew up in state care. This is a question for all three of you, but I will direct it first of all at you, Patrick, if I may. The report does not deny that there is racism of a kind in the UK, but it says it is not institutional. In other words, it is not endemic, embedded in our big organisations such as education, police, armed forces, etc. What makes you think that's wrong?
Well, if you look, I mean, it's quite clear that 2 weeks on since the report came out, it's been completely discredited by a whole range of academics, a whole range of social commentators like myself and Lee, and it's been discredited by a lot of people in the race equality industry. And more importantly, some of the commissioners themselves have now don't want to get involved or support in the recommendations. Because we now know that report was written.
No, I do get that a lot of people disagree with what has been written, but I'm asking you for evidence of institutional racism, and I'll take this from the report. We have argued for the use of the term institutional racism to be applied only when deep-seated racism can be proven on a systemic level and not be used as a general catch-all phrase for any microaggression, etc. It is not racism per se it's talking about it being endemic in institutions. What's your evidence to say that that's wrong?
We've got lots of evidence of endemic racism. Most of my experience, I've worked in NHS. There are clear evidence of endemic racism in how black and Asian minority staff are treated in the workforce. There's clear evidence around certain health conditions, around mental health, coronary heart disease. Today, as we speak, there's a debate taking place in Parliament around maternal deaths. Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth compared to white women. There's lots of evidence around. I mean, the police, there's loads of evidence. And the sad thing about it is we're approaching the 20th anniversary of the Macpherson report that looked into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And on the statute books in 2021, we have clear legislation around tackling structural racism. what the report is trying to do is trying to ignore that history, that long struggle from the Windrush generation to now. And of course, there are.
But could I just ask you this? You mentioned the National Health Service. My research has shown that 40% of NHS consultants, who are the most senior doctors in the health service, are from ethnic minorities. And the report has said it will set up an office for health disparities. This is covering some of those areas you say that are wrong at the moment, isn't it?
Well, well, going back to the health disparities unit, that was no different to a similar one that was set up 25 years ago by the Department of Health, led by the late Lord Chan, which is based in Leeds, which looked at data, looked at issues around overrepresentation in the mental health system. But the question I want to ask you is, the NHS was created in 1948, around about the same time when the Windrush generation arrived and the Windrush Empire, Windrush ship in 1948. By now, in 2021, we should have at least 4 dozen chief executives of NHS trusts, at least 5 dozen directors of nursing and medical directors. But we only have a handful in NHS, which is
we
the
do
biggest
have
employer.
40% of the most senior doctors coming from ethnic minorities. I'll come back to you, Patrick, of course, but Lee, let me throw this to you. Do you believe Britain is institutionally racist as a nation, as a society, or it is a racist society?
I think it's an institutionally racist country. I think all the evidence points to that. And let me just say that all of the research prior to this commission, which was done in depth by various professionals in their various sectors, criminal justice, policing, health, came to the same conclusion. This report doesn't explain why they're wrong, and it is right. And part of the response in reaching their conclusion on this report is that they've cherry-picked aspects of the report. I believe the country is institutionally racist, and I believe that can be demonstrated and seen and detected by the whole-scale racism and racial disadvantage and disproportionality that can be detected in the criminal justice system. Now, is racism nuanced? Does it impact on different ethnic groups differently? Well, of course it does. That stands to reason. A whole host of factors will influence that. And so the severity of its impact will depend entirely on the socioeconomic and cultural background of the group being targeted. So it is differentiated. It is nuanced, but it is.
But can I ask you this? Do you think British society is racist or not?
Yes, I do. I think it's quite clearly, demonstrably racist. And how do I demonstrate that? Well, it's by the disproportionate treatment of Meghan Markle. It's the disproportionate treatment of our leading footballers and sports stars, the media treatment they get, the online racism that they get, and the struggle that they face to reach the top of their careers in their respective...
Can I put this in from the report? It says social media, you mentioned social media, enormously amplifies racist views. And it means on both sides, that either side is allowed to exaggerate.
I don't know what you mean by either side. Are you suggesting that
those who say the society is racist and those who would try and enforce their racist views on other sections of society? I'm sorry if it wasn't clear, but that's what I meant.
Sorry. Well, look, black communities will say this, that social media has revealed the true extent of the racism that they've been aware of for the last 20 or 30 decades. That others have now become aware of it because it's been on social media. Maybe a surprise to them, but it's certainly not a surprise to the vast majority.
But could it not equally be a platform for those who are espousing their views that they are victims to exaggerate what they are going through? Just a question.
Nobody, if you know anything about being black and suffering racism, nobody wants to put themselves in the spotlight by claiming to be a victim of racism. You can ruin your career. You can receive a ton of abuse online, such as you've suggested. You could have stressful nights. It can lead to mental health breakdown. No black person puts themselves in that position so that they can be some sort of martyr to the cause. 99%, and I've been in this business 40 years, and I challenge anybody to suggest that a case that I have brought to highlight, and not just me, people like Patrick and many others, the case that I brought to national attention, none of them have said, oh, well, that turned out not to be true, didn't it, Lee? They have invariably substantiated their claim and complaint and gone on to achieve some level of justice. So I just think that's playing devil's advocate, but it doesn't really bring any useful insight into the experience of black people in this country.
Okay, we'll go around the table again in just a moment, but Aaron, let me bring you in on this. Am I right in saying you grew up in foster care, which is being looked after by families on a semi-permanent basis until another place can be found for you? It's state-sponsored care. Have you experienced, since you left foster care, institutional racism or racism in general?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And I was just going to say that, of course, in my time, as you say, in care, and since then, I have not experienced racism in any meaningful way, let alone a systemic way. My experiences growing up were...
What does a meaningful way mean? Sorry,
So I think it's important to define our terms here, actually, and it's quite frustrating, actually, to have conversations often when people are talking about one word or two words, but we have different meanings of these words. The word systemic or institutional, interchangeable in this case, is how Britain is being described for minorities, ethnic minorities, and it isn't true that this country is today a systemically racist, institutionally racist country. Are there racist people in this country? Do racist incidents happen in this country? Yes. But the word systemic is, as the report said itself, a distortion. It's spreading a distortion because what does it mean for something to be systemic? It means that it's the fundamental aspects in which the country is built on. Its laws, its politics, its key institutions. We mentioned the NHS. There are others, the Justice Department. The fundamental aspects of life, schools, education, working life. These systems are essentially built to maintain and ensure one race, one ethnic group, or a few outperform others specifically on purpose, intentionally, perhaps negligently. But that is not the experience that we have in this country. From listening to the conversation so far, you would think we're talking about China and the situation with the Uyghurs, the ethnic Turks there, who are Muslim in the western part of China. You think we're talking about the Jewish experience in Europe over the 20th century, or you think we're talking about the Rwandan experience for the Tutsis at the hands of the Hutus. But this is modern Britain we're talking about, where, as you said, someone like me went into care. I lived in numerous placements around the country, children's homes, foster placements, you name it, I was there, saw a lot. But one thing I didn't see or experience much of, don't get me wrong, a lot of abuse. Things happen that, I wouldn't discuss on air, but racism wasn't an aspect that was holding me back.
All right, can I come to this from Iman Aiton, who's fairly recent founder of a group called the Black Reformist Movement. She says, institutionalized racism, the big bad wolf that makes the faint-hearted squirm, is an uncomfortable and polarizing truth which, if acknowledged, could potentially endanger the very fabric of British identity, notwithstanding the fact that it would undermine the prevailing notion that the UK is a fair, tolerant and equitable society. Aaron, back with you in just a moment. But Lee, let me come to you. Take that quote into account and then look at these words from the report. These recommendations, if they're implemented, will give a further burst of momentum to the story of our country's progress to a successful multicultural community. Is Britain a successful multicultural community?
Well, it's more successful than some in a relative sense. Of course it is. I mean, that's just the nature of everything. It's not a binary debate. Can I just say, in relation to the definition of institutionalized racism, it's the legal definition of institutionalized racism as established by Sir William Macpherson in his groundbreaking report. So there's no confusion on our part about the nature of institutionalized racism. And although a young contributor has not faced any degree of racism, that's absolutely fine in his lived experience. But it doesn't negate the vast majority of black and ethnic minority communities who regularly report through attitudinal surveys that they are victims of institutionalized racism. So one swallow simply doesn't make a summer. In relation to
but could that not be also what the report terms microaggression, witting or unwitting, that it is racism in those words rather than as part of an institution?
Well, what we say is the experience of black communities is a 50-year cycle of institutionalized racism that has become greatly more amplified as years have progressed. So whilst we've eliminated the crude racism of signs in windows refusing to let properties to black people, of the kind of crude teddy boy racism that killed Kelsey Cochrane in 1958 in Notting Hill, what that has happened is that racism has become very much more covert, and we still see those disproportionate outcomes in terms of exclusions in school, something that's been high for African Caribbean communities for the last 40, 50 years consistently.
This is a slander. I think this is a slander on British people.
Aaron, give him a chance. I'll come back to you, I promise you.
Or indeed, the massive disproportionality that we see within the criminal justice system, that even by the definition of the police themselves have agreed was institutionally racist. So I think
that goes back some time, and it's an argument that I don't want to go into at the moment. The Macpherson report, all of 25 years ago. But let me ask you this, if I can, Patrick. No, I'm sorry. It's we only have a certain amount of time, Lee. That's the reason.
It's just a factual correction. You were factually wrong. So the College of Policing and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, in looking at the issue of stop and search in 2020, said there is no other explanation except institutionalized racism.
You talk about the police, Lee. I want to bring this up. The report recommends body cameras to increase accountability in stop and search instances. It also talks about bridging the gap between police and communities, addressing fairness in the workplace, telling multiple nuanced stories of contributions made by different groups across the centuries in Britain. In other words, telling a different story. All of those things are positive, Sean.
It paints a nice picture of what society could be like, but it didn't. Again, the report ignores lots of data and evidence of structural racism. It wants to create this impression that Britain is a post-racial society where there may be elements of discrimination there and about, but generally speaking, we're a tolerant society. The quote that you just gave us a while ago, and the quotes that's been used in the report, is trying to rewrite history. The history of Britain was made on enslavement and in colonisation, and that legacy is still pervasive in Britain. It wasn't until 2015 that we paid the last debt to the beneficiaries.
Fine, but the report recommends in schools, in educational establishments, telling multiple nuanced stories of the contributions made to our country by different groups, not just saying that we are a colonial superpower and that slavery didn't exist. It's addressing that.
And that's why I did a campaign many years ago, and I did a book last year called 100 Great Black Britain, celebrating Black British achievements. But a lot of that Black British achievement has been against, in the context of fighting racism, enslavement, and colonisation. And actually, some of the report commissioners actually are trying to play down a history of enslavement. They're trying to give the impression that actually, let's not talk about the profit, let's talk about that slavery was character building. It's one of the most offensive parts of the report, which has incensed a lot of people up and down the country. How can you talk about being enslaved as character building? That is the essence of that report, and that's why the report needs to be rejected, dumped in the bin, and we implement current reports.
Okay, Aaron, you wanted to say something for a few minutes. I had to stop you because you can't hear two people at once, and we can't if you talk while I'm talking. So please just hang on a second. What do you make of what you've heard so far? You're obviously getting sort of rather hot under the collar, if I may say so.
It's ridiculous. That's why, because it paints a picture that is just not true. So slavery in Britain, I mean, we didn't have slaves coming to this country. We weren't the United States in a mass way. I mean, our judges were ruling slavery, inconsistent with common law in 1772, before the United States was even a country. We had anti-slavery acts in the early 1800s. Which other country? Was the Spanish Armada or the French Navy or the Dutch? Which other great empire or country was making those advancements in the 19th century? I mean, look, today you talk about stop and search. You say, maybe the reason that unfortunately Black people are more likely to be stopped and searched than white people are because, according to the Metropolitan Police themselves, 75% of knife offenders are Black and ethnic minority. So is it really a shock that we find that the majority of people who are stopped and searched in London particularly are Black and ethnic minority, if 75% of knife offenders are also Black and ethnic minority? This is not a shock. The truth is that this country is a place where you can achieve whatever you want to, irrespective of your race. In many ways, I think we are a post-racial society.
Can I stop you there? I'm going to stop you there because I want to move on to Lee and ask you this. In terms of opportunities, because that's the point that Aaron is making here. Again, in my research, I read that there is a greater proportion of people from ethnic minorities going to university than white British people. The opportunity is there. It's just not spoken about, perhaps.
Well, we also have something like approaching 36% black and ethnic minority graduate unemployment. So the educational good news story is slightly undermined by the discrimination people face in the labour market. And
How can
of course,
you
there's
conclude it's discrimination that's causing them to not get a job?
Hold on. I don't interrupt you. So let's just have a proper debate. It's also undermined by the fact that black and ethnic minorities drop out in the first year of universities in a disproportionately higher rate than most other ethnic groups. So there's a full contextualization around this issue that needs to be fully understood.
But isn't that my point, that as you said earlier on, Lee, it is so nuanced, it's impossible to come out and fairly judge a report like this with the inflammatory headlines that we've had?
Well, it is, because I think is what I would ask. The headlines were reflected a political agenda of government that wanted to undermine the Black Lives Matter movement, wanted to fundamentally challenge the concept of institutionalized racism. And
okay, let's bring Aaron back in, and then Patrick, it's your turn because we don't have an awful lot of time. Sorry, quickly, Aaron, if you would.
I'll try to be quick, but we've heard a lot today about saying, oh, black people are doing less here. You know, the percentage here isn't quite what we want. Oh, more black students don't graduate university, this and that. How is it proving that there are different outcomes between different ethnic groups, evidence of systemic racism? Even if you're correct in saying, and I'm not disputing because I think it is generally correct, that yes, black women are more likely to have complications in childbirth than white women. That's a conclusion. Great. Let's find out why. You've just jumped straight to it must be that the white man hates the black man. You've got no evidence for it, and if you have not presented it during this conversation. And that's what I'm trying to say. That outcomes, different outcomes and disparities don't necessarily mean discrimination.
Well, he has said it is extremely nuanced. We'll have to leave that at that particular point. Patrick, let me ask you. I don't know how far back your family goes in the United Kingdom, but would you say it's less racist now than it was a generation ago, 2 generations, 5, 6, 7 generations?
So I'm in Wolverhampton with my parents. I was born in Wolverhampton. My parents came here when Enoch Powell was a local MP. He made that speech in 1968, Rivers of Blood. That speech incited and influenced really the current day, modern day legislation around immigration control, particularly hostile environment policy, because that gave the impression that Britain was under siege by black and brown people, which isn't the case. We've actually added to Britain in many ways. So from the time I grew up in Wolverhampton, where there was a National Front used to march regularly in the town centre, it's different now. You don't have that overt discrimination, but what you have, it's inbuilt in the system. In Wolverhampton, there are hardly any senior black people working in the NHS. There's hardly any senior black people working in the local authority, and the community organisations that are trying to do fantastic work in the community around mental health, around sickle cell and other health projects are underfunded, are not valued and respected. So,
but you really do believe? Do I get this impression that it is a less racist society than it was for your parents?
No, it's different. The racism's different. Behind me, I've got pictures. I've got 4 sisters. We've all been to university and got degrees. So there is individual achievements and there has been progression. But the nature of racism changes and it forms. We now have a situation where we have a young 25-year-old on this call who believes that there wasn't an issue around enslavement in Britain because we didn't have plantations in the West Midlands or Cornwall. We had plantations in the colonies. They were there deliberately to make, and all the profits came to London. So it's really naive. So it's really naive for you to give an analysis, and that's what they're trying to do in this report.
Okay, different opinions, everybody. Listen, there are different
history. I think that every country in the world that was as powerful as we were back in those days had slaves. Slavery was wrong, but it wasn't like we were the only ones. I'm just saying that compared to everyone else, we are the most tolerant and most inclusive society today.
Gonna have to leave it there.
When you look at the work that's been done.
I'm sorry, everybody. You can continue this conversation, but we won't be recording only because we've run out of time. Could have talked to you all day, each and every one of you. Listen, thank you very much indeed. Apologies for me having to interrupt, but I've got to keep it moving on. Very, very interesting to hear your points of view, very different points of view. Listen, from me, David Foster, thank you for coming on the programme. And wherever you happen to be watching this programme, thank you for taking the time to do so. You can find more on our YouTube channel. That's TRT World Roundtable YouTube. Join us next time. From me, David Foster, goodbye.